everybody, or good morning, depending on where in the world you are. Welcome to the first seminar in the 2022 Digital Classes London series. We're delighted this week to welcome Matei Tichindelean from UCLA, where he's working on his PhD, and who's going to talk to us about some 3D work that he did a couple of years ago. Just before I introduce him and hand over to him, I will just invite anybody watching live to leave comments in the live chat beside your YouTube video. You can leave a comment now to say hi, let us know you're watching. That would be great. But also, if at any point during or after the seminar you have any comments or questions or anything else you'd like to say or contribute, please feel free to leave it in the chat there, and we will see it and we will try to respond to it and answer any questions if you like. There will be some time for discussion at the end of this seminar, and we hope that you all will join the discussion as well if you're watching live. If you're watching this later and not live, then welcome. I hope you enjoy the seminar. Sorry that you can't, take part in the discussion as well, but we're glad you're watching too. Okay, so I think I will hand over to Matei, who's going to talk about the digital reconstruction of the Akhenaten torso in the Brooklyn Museum. Over to you, Matei.
Thank you. I'm going to share my slides. So I hope that everyone can see my slides. Thank you all for having me here at the Digital Classes London virtual seminar today. And a particular thank you to Dr. Gabrielle Bodard for inviting me to participate in the summer series. My name is Matei Tichindelean, and I am a third-year PhD student in the Coates Institute of Archaeology at University of California, Los Angeles. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the utilization of 3D technologies, such as photogrammetry, among which is photogrammetry, in the field of Egyptology, and how I employed digital tools and environments to reconstruct and recontextualize a fragmentary statue of Akhenaten housed at the Brooklyn Museum. So I initiated my research on the Brooklyn Museum Akhenaten torso in 2017 while I was part of the Egyptian sculpture digitization project led by Professor Steve Vincent at Indiana University, Bloomington. My time at Indiana University was spent between two worlds, that of digital humanities in the informatics and computing department, and the Egyptological world in the Near Eastern languages and cultures department. It was through these two programs that my interest in the field of 3D technologies was piqued. I initially only sought to help to digitize the Brooklyn Museum's Egyptian art collection as part of Professor Vincent's effort to facilitate wider access to the collection. However, I found this particular piece immensely fascinating for reasons that I will shortly discuss. And I realized that I could better analyze the statue by virtually reconstructing the piece to a series of different possibilities to kind of try to extract its original form. And then to contextualize it via three-dimensional representation of its original environment. So today, I'll be presenting to you a succinct overview of the culmination of this research project, which ultimately was the subject of my MA thesis, a study that is at the intersection of three fields: digital humanities, Egyptology, and art history. So to do so, I will, one, talk about the work undertaken in the Brooklyn Museum and the processes associated with generating the model, then situate us in time and space in order to address some of my research questions. And then third, and finally, I'll walk you through my reconstructions that help to address the research questions. So the main research questions that you can see up on the screen, going kind of from the micro level to a more broader research interest. The first one was, what was the statue's original form and pose? Then I sought to look for the purpose of the statue, where it was located, and who was its intended audience. And then finally, to kind of connect it to the bigger questions that we have in Egyptology, I am interested in finding out how these statues functioned in Akhenaten's reformed religion, reformed ideology. So as I mentioned, the first question attempts to address the uniqueness of this particular piece. Note that there are not that many life-size statues of Akhenaten, and for the sake of time, I will not go into the fascinating background of this 18th dynasty ancient Egyptian king, fondly remembered as the heretic king. So, the potential to put forth hypotheses and to digitally reconstruct and experiment with different iterations, poses, weight distributions, etc., of the statue was only possible through reconstructing the model in a virtual environment. Subsequently, the experiments that allowed me to answer the first question also provide a glimpse into the statue's purpose, its location, and audience. And the third question then attempts to address the larger theological questions concerning the ideology of the Amarna period, and I'll talk about that briefly shortly, by putting it back into its context. So the torso stands somewhat larger than life-size in a small gallery dedicated to the Amarna period art. The partially destroyed statue was found by Flinders Petrie during the 1891-92 excavation season at Tel El Amarna. It then became part of Lord Amherst's collection until 1921, when it was sold together with a variety of other Amarna period pieces to a private collector. It subsequently arrived in the Brooklyn Museum collection with the aid of the Charles Edwin Wilbur Endowment Fund. And you can see here the location of it and how it is housed in that specific gallery. As you can see, the statue is protected by a plexiglass vitrine and placed in the middle of the gallery. You can see in the photos the spotlights shine on it from above, in addition to a mix of natural and artificial light that falls on it from adjacent galleries, and emergency lights. For example, red light from exit signs, and other light that is really unable to be turned off. So the challenge to document and create an accurate photogrammetric model was the first hurdle to overcome. And for those of you that are not familiar, photogrammetry is the science of extracting 3D information from two-dimensional photographs by taking a series of overlapping photos from various angles and then inputting them into a software where the algorithm, in this case, the software was Aegisoft Metashape, reconstructs a three-dimensional representation of the object. It took us 3 attempts to circumnavigate these difficulties that could not be avoided because of various security and time constraints. Here, you can see the relative thickness of the plexiglass in the middle photo, and the reflection of some of the overhead lights. And these photos are part of the first 2 attempts at modeling an accurate model of this. I'm sorry, the things that you hear in the background are my cats. They're pandemic cats, so whenever I am in front of the computer, they go crazy. I apologize about that. But on our third attempt, a little bit more flexibility was allowed to us. We received permission to turn off some of the gallery lights. However, removing the vitrine was still not allowed. Together with Professor Gabriele Guidi, we devised an innovative way to minimize the distortions caused by the plexiglass and therefore reduce the margin of error when rendering a 3-dimensional model. The photographs had to be taken at a 90-degree angle from all directions with a high overlap rate. The camera lens had to be placed perpendicular to the vitrine, and the use of a tripod in this was crucial. In the end, 74 raw photographs were taken and later processed in editing software Adobe Lightroom to adjust the white balance and exposure. Then the state model that you see in these snapshots was processed in Aegisoft metaship. So after creating the state model, and by this I mean the current state of the torso, I moved on to the restoration process in order to create a visualization of the statue's original appearance. The software package ZBrush was used to add both arms and Akhenat's head, the head being based on a 3D model rendered from Museum August Kestner in Hanover on the right, generously provided by Eric Jagemann of Formwerk 3D and Professor Christian Löben. The stylistic elements of the head, however, dated to an earlier reign a period in the early reign of Akhenaten. So I had to adjust some facial features to match the artistic choice employed by the artist that worked on our Brooklyn torso. The reconstruction of the arms proved to be the most difficult task. The arms needed to be moved, resized, altered, and repositioned into what I explain later, and you can kind of see it on the left over here, an offering table pose. Additionally, this part of the process required the complete rebuilding of the shoulders, which, if you remember, our statue does not have. The kilt and legs were reconstructed from a photogrammetric model of this statuette in the middle in the Brooklyn Museum. It was a quite difficult process since the kilt and the legs have to be scaled up, and the round belly that you see here on the statue needed to be adjusted to reflect, again, the style that matched our torso. And this statuette is a very small, about 10 centimeters high statuette. After the offering pose statue was, afterwards, the offering pose statue was painted and texturized, and the resulting OBJ file was imported into the architectural software SketchUp Pro and into my reconstruction that you see here on the lower right side, my draft reconstruction of the small Aten temple. Similar steps were undertaken when reconstructing this seated statue, which was based on a 3D model that you see here on the left of Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, that is up on Sketchfab, and it was built by Peter Dermanuelian. And I will go more into this statue shortly. Then the work on reconstructing the statue's original form began, and this was based mainly, as I try to situate us in time and space, on its archaeological context and art historical comparanda. As with many statues typical of Akhenaten's reign, the collarbones are accentuated. On his chest are 3 inscribed cartouches that were hacked out in retribution for his unpopular religious reforms. However, as you can see here, one seems to have been missed. It is found on the lower left side of the back. This incomplete cartouche allows us to date the sculpture of Akhenaten to the first 9 regnal years. And if we want to be more precise, between the time that he moved his capital to Amarna, to Tell Amarna, and his 4th regnal year and his 9th regnal year. So about 1366 to 1360 BCE. Around the torso's waist are clear traces of a sash, a pleated skirt, which is a common feature of most sculptures of Akhenaten, as you will shortly see. And as you can see in this lower right snapshot, the torso is supported by a back pillar, which runs halfway up its back and slopes towards the neck, possibly imitating a wide flail that would have been attached to the statue's neck and its headdress, and farther up into its headdress. And just to situate us in space as well, the statue was found at Tel Amarna over here in Middle Egypt, which was the purpose-built capital of Akhenaten, designed primarily as worship center for the supreme god, the Aten. And you can see here a layout of the city itself, with the main central part being dominated by this large temple. And the temple that you've seen and that you'll see again will be this little back temple right here. So unfortunately, Petrie did not provide a specific find spot within his archaeological report. It was most likely found buried south of the temple in a cache outside the temenos wall with other fragmentary statues and offering tables, all purposefully destroyed after Akhenaten's death. Presumably somewhere in this area that you see highlighted, Petrie records 17 objects belonging to this cache, to this group of artifacts, including several fragments for royal statuary and offering slabs. The exact description reads: cap, 2 bits head, most of torso with odd names, over life size, medium stone, and work. It's hard to say with 100% certainty that the description refers to the Brooklyn torso, but I haven't come across any other examples in public collections that matches this description more than the Brooklyn torso. Also significant is the fact that the torso was buried together with 2 hands with an offering slab. The offering slab with hands for the Metropolitan Museum of Art depicted here in the lower right is just one example of the many, many fragmentary offering slabs, some with hands, some without, that were recovered from Amarna and Petrie's excavations. And I chose this particular one to show to you because it matches the torso both in the year that it was found and the stone type. So you can see here the low fingers holding up what would be an offering table, which is just a limestone slab. So, in an attempt to further address the research questions, the archaeological context and art historical comparisons were taken into account. And this is archaeological comparison in a 3-dimensional and 2-dimensional space. So in the time that I have left, I want to give you a quick overview as to how I arrived at these 2 most likely reconstructions and what it can tell us about the original function, its context within the small Aten temple, and the audience that it was made for. The 2 most important reasons for this reconstruction in the offering pose are illustrated in these 2 snapshots. The cartouches, his belly button and his abs on the front needed to be visible. This also includes the cartouche on his hip that you see down here, which means his arms could not have been straight because it would cover the one on the hip, most likely, but were bent at the elbow. And you can kind of see another evidence of this is this little space over here that you can see is not a break, but it's part of the statue itself. So it's smoothed over. It's not a break, as you can see here. Which in reality, this is the main reason that the statue was reconstructed holding an offering table, as you see on the right. Furthermore, the half pillar and the elongating element are not only here for structural support, but are unquestionably part of the headdress. So the half pillar comes away halfway up its back and this elongated kind of element. So in terms of the headgear, there are 2 possible headdresses that have a flailing or this widening element. One could be a cut headdress, the one that you see here. A cut headdress is what Egyptologists call it, that you see here in my reconstruction. And 2, the blue crown, a symbol of kingship that in some depictions also sports a kind of widening at the back. So in order to walk you through my reconstruction process, I'll quickly go over some Amarna statuary to show how difficult it is to choose a reconstruction, mainly because of the fragmentary corpus we have for the statuary. As alluded to earlier, most statues were destroyed, and the surviving examples, most that you can see here, in fact, are small statues under 15 centimeters in height. So keeping in mind that the cartouches and the belly button need to be visible, and the connection to the headdress, of the headdress to the back pillar is key. I'll quickly go over these. There are a few colossal statues. So these are larger than life-size statues that come from a temple in modern-day Luxor, Karnak, of Akhenaten, depicted in what Egyptologists call the Osirian pose, and that's mainly with either one or two hands across his chest, which in our case is not a possibility, mainly because the cartouches on the chest have to be visible. Moving on to the stela, to the statue holding a stela from the museum in Berlin, you can see that there is space, even in the small, about 11 centimeter high statue that the artist chose to include to connect the statue to the stela. So this space would also, as you can see, render the belly button, would cover up the belly button, which we can't have in our torso. Similarly, these next two statues, which are in fact holding an offering table, much like as my reconstruction, have a couple problems with them. The first one in the Kara Museum, as you can see, again, even the small 11 or 12 centimeter high statue has a back pillar that comes all the way to its neck, which ours doesn't. They also have, both statues also have this triangular support that the Egyptian artists put to hold the weight of the offering slab. And ours does not have anything that would hint at something protruding from its from above its belly button, like you see in these two. One other possibility would be a different type of statues that's holding a stela. And you see here in a drawing by Robert Hay that was made in 1827, these statues do not do not survive anymore. But these statues are from the hills surrounding Amarna, the capital. They're part of a boundary stela statuary program. But you see here Akhenaten as a standing with Nefertiti, and what would have been here a similar stela like this, but at an angle. And these are actually life-size statues. However, even these types of statues appear to have a connection between its belly and the stela slab. Perhaps the most, the best comparable statue is this statue from the Metropolitan Museum, which is smaller, slightly smaller than life-size, and was also found in Amarna. But as you can see and you can see here, it also has cartouches on its chest, and perhaps the arms also went either to its side or maybe bent to be holding an offering table. But unlike ours, this has a pillar that goes all the way up to support its probably its crown and its neck, much like this one. And a similar thing with this statue from the August Kestner Museum in Hanover. You see that the back pillar comes all the way supporting its neck, which ours, if you remember, stops halfway off the back. Okay. So in order to best inform our reconstruction and reconstructionalization, we have to turn to two-dimensional representations. So in the snapshot on the left from the tomb of Huya, located in the hills of Amarna, we can see a scene from the temple, the great temple of Akhenaten. You can see here that Akhenaten is depicted in the offering pose. In these ones, this is his wife. And in fact, these depictions appear to be statues because of the presence of back pillars. And usually depictions during this time period of the king and his family are not really as stiff as you see over here. They're a bit more free-flowing. The scene on the right, however, is pretty clear evidence that this Amarna talatat, and a talatat is a standardized stone block used in the construction of the temple, very popular construction method during this time period, depicts the innermost part of the sanctuary of the small Aten temple. And this has been identified by Egyptologists such as Cooney and Aldred. And the depiction clearly shows two figures over here. most likely statues in the offering pose, wearing the cot headdress. You can see here, if you remember the cot headdress from a reconstruction. And this does not only give us a clue about the headdress and its pose, holding offerings in an offering table. You can see there the offering slab, and the statue holding the offering slab. But it also gives us the most likely location of the statue, mainly the inner sanctum of the small Aten temple. So the function of the statue is also hinted by the offering pose, which depicts Akhenaten as an offering bearer. In this instance, it represents the king performing his daily duty as the principal prophet of the Aten, the sole provider and the only one that has access to the god. So therefore, in consultation with the evidence that I just presented, I suggest a few possible locations for the statue depicting the king in the offering pose, and fulfilling its role as not only an active participant in the daily ritual, but when you consider the materiality, the choice of depicting the king in stone, its function, which is intended to depict the offering act in perpetuity, so the king offering forever. And I just want to point out that this is where I place them in front of the main sanctuary as depicted in the Talatat here. But there are other possibilities we have this in two-dimensional depictions in tomb scenes, like this one in front of actually offering tables, which there are many hundreds even within this temple itself. So there's a few here in the innermost sanctuary, there's a few in the courtyard, but then we also have these kind of depictions in between columns. So in terms of the audience and the access, in this case, the audience would have been the Aten himself, the god himself, the recipient of the offerings. So moving on to the other option, the seated pose. In my previous reconstruction in the offering pose, there is admittedly one big problem that remains to be solved, namely that we don't really have any archaeological comparanda like we have for the seated pose. And there's not a indication of what the Egyptians prefer to do, which is, even in these small statues, include a triangular support for this offering slab. But I have other explanations for that that I'm happy to answer in the Q&A at the end. So I want to quickly go over option B that I'll show you in a bit. It fits many comparanda that we actually see in the archaeological record, and also the two-dimensional depictions that are present in the tombs surrounding Amarna. So the background is not the only option. If we return to the scene depicting the small Aten temple from the tomb of Mary Ra, we can see a seated statue that wears the blue crown, the flat blue crown, with a flail that can account for one of the back pillar of the statue. Let me zoom in over here a little bit so you can see here the seated statue with the little flail that kind of is halfway up. It's with this flat blue crown, is what the Egyptologists call it. The fact that there are numerous examples of these seated statues throughout Egyptian history, and with a great number of them from Akhenaten's father's reign, Amenhotep III, speaks volume. But the final and most exciting piece of evidence are two small limestone fragments that were found in recent excavations at Amarna that appear to match fragments from earlier excavations. So the Met Museum throne fragment and the limestone piece from the Museum of Man in San Diego, which I have not been able to track down a picture of it. I apologize, but Marcia Hill describes it over here. Were both excavated by the Metropolitan Museum sometime in the early 1900s. They both come from an area within the sanctuary And in a recent 2018 article, Marcia Hill presented these two objects as evidence of a seated statue located in the exact same area shown in the depiction. So in this depiction over here. Moreover, the archaeological features located in the area show the exact installations depicted in the tomb of Mary Ra. A platform approached via a ramp where a giant stela would have stood. So this big feature over here, the ramp being this. And next to it, a platform designed to support a heavy statue because it is reinforced over here with limestone. Perhaps the seated statue from the depiction. Most importantly, both fragments are made from the same type of limestone as the Brooklyn torso. So in this reconstruction, the pose of our seated statue shows the king as the one who is receiving the offerings. And in this case, it appears that the offerings that the king is receiving are other statues and statuettes. This is evident because various statue fragments made from various kinds of stone were found by Marcia Hill and her team in 2017 and 2019 in this exact area. So in this case, the audience would have been the high elite and the few priestly classes that were allowed to enter this space. To sum up, the statue's pose does not only provide clues about the intended function, but also allows us to suggest the original location of the statue within the temple. With this in mind, this model on the left shows Akhenaten in an offering pose as an active participant in the daily offering ritual to the Aten. And the statue on the right shows a seated king in a more passive pose. Here, he is the receiver of the offerings, acting as the intermediary between the Aten and the people. And in my MA dissertation, I consider other possible reconstructions that for various reasons are less probable than the two that I'm presenting here. But unfortunately, I can't go into detail on those because of time. But ultimately, the uniqueness of this piece allowed me to employ digital tools to test art historical and Egyptological hypotheses. And more importantly, to recontextualize even the tiny fragments that are spread in museums throughout the world. So as a final note, I want to say a big thank you to the Brooklyn Museum staff, particularly Katya Barbash, Kathy Zurek-Dulé, Ed Bleiberg, and thank you to Professor Steve Vinson, Bernard Fischer, and Gabriela Guidi for their advice and for their feedback. Thank you. I hope I didn't go too much over time.
Not at all, on the contrary. Great, thank you very much, Matei. This is very very exciting work. It's really nice to see both the archaeological and art historical questions being asked, as well as some of the advanced digital techniques being used. So that's always really really cool to see. So if anybody who's watching this live has any questions or comments or anything else you'd like to say or contribute to the discussion, please do use the live chat to do so. We'll be very happy to hear from you, and we'll try to address those comments. In the meantime, I had a thought. I'm still sort of digesting the whole the whole sort of reconstruction question. So I've got a slightly more general question, maybe just to warm up. You talk in admirable detail about the various different research that you've done that feeds into your reconstruction and your alternative reconstructions of this. And I wonder if you'd thought about how you would communicate that research in a 3D model itself, or connected to the 3D model in any form other than I mean, obviously, you write an article, you've written your thesis that's related to that and so forth. But is there any way to connect this research to the model itself in an explicit way? I'm thinking of the way that that the London Charter and that Valery Vitale's work on documenting 3D reconstructions try to talk about the importance of keeping this documentation inseparable from the model itself.
Yeah, I thought about that briefly, and probably the best way to do that is one, to annotate the model, but also perhaps in a way highlight the different parts of the model that came from different research, whether that's two-dimensional depictions, three-dimensional statuaries that we have, the three-dimensional OBJ files that I had to download and to recreate, to put them all together. It's something that would probably present a final product of the statue itself, highlighted with different parts of it. The shoulders, the arms, the offering slab, with perhaps pictures and references as to where it came from. That would be, if I was to present this to in an overarching paper. The paper that I publish only deals with the reconstruction, not necessarily talking about the recontextualization with it. That was part of the second part of my MA thesis in terms of the reconstruction of the temple itself, which in itself has many different forms, many different variations. I'll touch on the biggest debate, which is, if you saw, my reconstruction has these little ramps, this ramp thing. Some people think that instead of walls, shadows during this time period in this temple construction tried to be minimized. So a lot of people think that the walls maybe would not have been that high, or that any type of shadow needed to be avoided. So that the sun, the Aten itself, the god, could touch it. So the same kind of process, I imagine, would have to be explained in the architectural reconstruction of the temple, which in itself would probably be double of as large of an endeavor as the statue itself. I hope I addressed your question.
Yes, absolutely. Did you think about an interactive version of the model that maybe had some of these things embedded in it as annotations or similar? I'm thinking of the way you could present this in Sketchfab, say, or
Yeah.
similar interface.
Yeah, so in fact, if you go on my Sketchfab account, the statue itself, both statues itself, are placed within their context with annotations, kind of walking you behind the reasoning for their placement, and showing two-dimensional representations that inform the placement there and the reconstruction. That I haven't included in this presentation. But if you go to my Sketchfab, which is Matei 4, I believe is my username. I haven't been on there for a while.
Just found it and posted it in the chat. So if anyone else wants to look at it,
yeah. And I know it was a choice, seeing how this was an MA thesis and I had a limited time at the university. It was a choice. I could have gone in way more detail in terms of the architectural reconstruction itself, but I see the architectural part as kind of more of a mechanism to house my focus, which is the reconstruction of the torso.
Yeah. Cool. So I'm distracted playing with your 3D models now.
Oh, no worries.
Great. In the meantime, we have one question in the chat. Karabasa has asked, how did you figure out the measurements of the missing pieces, in particular since the reference materials were not the same size?
Yeah, that was the most difficult part. And a big part of it, the most difficult of all, was taking a three-dimensional model that I made of one of those small statues, the legs in particular, and kind of, not only would I have to mess with the belly to make it more of an ab and not really a belly, but also to scale it. And in terms of the height, in terms of the height, if I may go back to just this little the screen over here, we have evidence for the possible height of these offering tables. They're called offering tables, but they're basically a bunch of mud bricks that are arranged, to form a rectangular thing, and then white plaster is put over them. So they form like kind of a solid rectangular thing. So we have an idea of that height, and my model needed to be presenting its offering table right above that. So in a way, with that in mind, and with knowing the relative height of this statue as well, which is slightly smaller than, I don't know if you see the statue, which is slightly smaller than mine. I kind of try to make an educated guess. And in terms of how long the arms were, and there was a whole other discussion that I go into my thesis more. But a big problem, and the reason why they have this, is the potential weight of the piece of limestone, this offering slab, which I had one of my engineering friends help me kind of to determine how close to the body it should be, in order for, taking into account the density of limestone, or the average density of limestone, in order for the statue not to tip forward. And it turns out that the Egyptians knew exactly what they were doing, hence the reason for back pillars in a lot of statues.
Yeah. I was wondering if, and this is completely naive without any knowledge of the density of stone or anything else, if the presence of those supports underneath the offering table on the smaller statues, and the absence of it, presumably on your statue and on other large statues, was just because a big enough statue, the arms were thick enough and strong enough that they didn't need that support.
Exactly. And one of the other things that I was that was popular in the worship of the Aten, and that was popular even though some of the depictions present, things like a leg of a cow, for example, on the offering table itself. But most of them, if you go through the depictions, depict things like fruit and flowers. So if the ancient Egyptians, in their worship, to kind of perpetuate this eternal offering to the Aten, actually put physical objects onto the slab itself to add extra weight, most likely they would have been things like flowers or fruit. I imagine that the big heavy pieces of cow meat that they would have had on there for probably not that much, because people probably ate them, were placed on the solid offering tables.
And even with with a huge great stone statue like that, the weight of even a big metal bowl of stew or something wouldn't topple it over, because the stone is
exactly
so heavy already. Yeah.
And just like the offering tables that were plastered over, they were kind of smoothed into the plastered white surface that was the floor of the temple itself. So you kind of had like a glue holding it to ensure that it doesn't tip.
Yeah. I was wondering why there are so many of those offering tables. Were they all in use at once? Do we imagine hundreds of people in there all making offerings, or did they make offerings and leave them there, and that's why other people use different ones? Or
that's a good question. I think a lot of people are asking that. There are hundreds in this temple, and if I go back to my PowerPoint real quick, as you see in this picture, depicted on this picture, but in this inset, there are thousands even outside this bigger Aten temple, which has in itself hundreds of those offering tables inside, but even thousands in there. And it's hard to say if they were all populated with offerings. We do have evidence, and some depictions in elite tombs do show this kind of daily ritual offering of cows being slaughtered close to the temple, and then offering tables with offerings on top of them. And we do have also textual depictions that mentions actually diplomats from places like Hattusha coming and having to endure in the middle of the Egyptian sun while the priests are doing their offerings. So for sure, some of them were used. It's hard to say to what extent all of them were used, and what exactly, if every one of them was populated with some kind of offering. Surely bread would have been easy because they have installations that would make thousands and thousands of pieces of bread next to them, so they could do that en masse. Vegetables and flowers is another possibility.
Do we have any evidence that that these offering tables were potentially reserved for individuals or families? Like, do we have any names on them or things like that?
So this is no. This is the other thing about Akhenaten and really the whole ideology behind his new religious reforms and the movement here. As he was the main person that had access to God, and really the only person, he acted as an intermediary. That's why he had to be depicted in statues making offerings, because the roles of priests were very much reduced, and we only have evidence of probably less than 10 people with priestly titles that acting within these temple installations at Amarna. So the priestly classes were reduced, and even the elites. There's different texts that in my paper I go to kind of show that these statues are acting on behalf of the king himself, because he is the one that controls everything from access to the afterlife to ensuring that the cosmos works, and he does that by making offering himself to the god. And that's why, even though we have all these low statues of him offering, most of them have been smashed after he died, and ritualistically it seems buried for that reason. And there's a whole discussion that we can go into with that, because that's in itself is fascinating, the destruction of these. And one of the things I guess that I would like to someday take it further is possible ways that the torso itself shows different acts of destruction. So chopping of the head, of the arms, kind of a thing, which I think putting it in some kind of game engine would be the next step to kind of experiment with that.
Right. I guess what I was unclear on was just how unique these temple designs are to the temples of Aten. I mean, these masses of offering tables, they're specific to temples of Aten, are they?
Yes, the large number of them, yes.
Okay.
We do have other evidence of statues holding offering tables or depictions of offering tables. It was a very common practice that almost every Egyptian, at least every high elite Egyptian, especially in this time period, had in front of their tombs, in front of their family tombs. So it's the offering tables, I guess, in this iteration of Akhenaten's religion, is kind of the step between a popular religious practice related to the cult of the dead, to something that spilled into the daily ritual that would happen every day, probably multiple times a day.
Right. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. If anyone else on YouTube has any other questions, please do ask them. Otherwise, I'm going to keep annoying Matei with my just idle questions about Egyptian religion, which are fascinating,
I'm enjoying it.
Not very scholarly questions, probably in most cases. So yeah, we will continue to keep an eye on the chat if there are any other questions. I guess sort of going back to the 3D technologies, maybe, is there? Do you want to say maybe a little bit more about the relationship between imaging and actual sculpting? I mean digital sculpting that you're doing. I mean, to what degree, you know, are you imaging the torso itself and imaging other statues and scaling them and putting them on and so forth? And to what degree do you say, well, I know what this sort of, I know what a human bicep looks like, even if I don't have an example, I'm just going to sculpt it.
Yeah. So as I showed, the whole project starts with photogrammetry, rendering a very high definition that unfortunately our screens are perhaps not able to share that high definition. And having taken that and beginning to sculpt it in ZBrush, you can see here some of my trials and error, and I just put some of these up because they kind of are funny and they look funny. There was a lot of going back and forth between representations of sculptures that we have a lot of his father, which Egyptologists and art historians can trace a clear influence of Akhenaten in his statuary program based on his father's later statuary program. So in terms of things like arms, I kind of borrow from that. But again, the three-dimensional model had to be, the photogrammetic model had to be kind of decimated so it could fit some of the sculpting, so it could fit some of the reworking that I had to do on the face, removing of geometry, like this crown is not the correct crown, removing of things like the back pillar. It was to put it simply, there were all informed decisions that were informed in terms of the three-dimensional model itself, in the statuary, in three-dimensional depictions. But then again, I had to make certain choices, as in the length of the neck, for example. And Akhenaten, as you can see just from these two depictions, also kind of changed that halfway through his reign. His neck, became shorter, whereas before it was a kind of a long neck. These kind of also a little bit later in his reign kind of went away, the little pectoral things. So there were certain, as you can see here, the writing of the cartouches are not as nice as you might see on this photogrammetic model over here. But it was all a process. I'm not sure if I managed to answer your question. It was all a process of borrowing from different statuaries, from different representations. And in some cases, because again, since most of them were destroyed and we were missing things like necks on Akhenaten statues and shoulders, and the whole lower part of it, had to be educated guesses.
Yeah, I guess. No, sorry, Karen.
No, that really, in terms of, for me, the best software to do it was ZBrush. That allowed for a combination of, and ZBrush is, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of a gaming modeling software. But ZBrush was perfect because it allowed to first of all render these high definition photogrammetic model, but then I was also allowed to add to them, decimate them, so making them a little bit less, I don't know how to put it, realistic, I guess, less like a realistic photogrammetic model. And play with even little things like moving the arms, moving the fingers closer or farther apart.
And so you talk about making them less realistic. Was that a deliberate feature to to avoid misleading the audience into thinking that this was, you know, too convincing? Or
to a certain extent, that was made the less realistic. Yes, in short, yes, I did not want to give the impression that this is the only and correct answer in this reconstruction, and to kind of to, in a way, in terms of the painting and everything else, show that these statues, unlike what we see in museums or in some statuary museums, were all painted, and they would have been all colorful in a place that would have been mostly white in terms of the paving, you know, the offering tables. The hieroglyphs would have probably been painted on a temple as well. But everything else was meant to get a direct hit by the sunlight, by the Aten, the god, and be brightened by him.
Yes, thank you. Great. We have another question from Akarabasa again, asking if you think this sort of reconstructing, recontextualizing could be used more generally for all sorts of other kinds of fragments, or is there something specific, unique about the Akhenaten style that makes it suited for this?
That's an excellent question. I think in my field of Egyptology, in terms of that is based on a lot of our, whenever we address statuary, we obviously have to take into account our history. And in my field of Egyptology, a lot of it is based on art historical COMPARANDA, and having the ability of different 3D tools to reconstruct this, as I have, would allow, I think, for better comments and perhaps for more freedom in its reconstruction. And Akhenaten, the statuary program of Akhenaten, because there are so many fragmentary ones, because they were purposely destroyed, I think would greatly benefit from that. And it's also, I think, in terms of, and part of the reason why I have done it as well is also in order to visualize it better and to better explain it to non-Egyptologists, people that are not versed in the art historical background that's required to analyze these types of statuary. Did I answer? I think I grabbed most of the things in that question. And recontextualizing it specifically, because not only were the statues destroyed, but the city itself and a lot of inscriptions that have anything to do with Akhenaten himself from all over Egypt. I think it could definitely give us a better idea of the ideology behind this sudden shift in religion.
Right. Yeah. I was wondering how universal the damnatio of Akhenaten was outside of specifically the religious context, which was obviously the main objection. But you're saying it's pretty much everywhere. Yeah. We're lucky to know about him. Yeah.
Even in private tombs. His figure itself is chiseled out, and we know that it might have been his name, so his cartouches, and his figure is chiseled out, and we know it because the chiseling out of his figure is typical of his style. So we know, like, oh, this guy has a very long neck. It's most likely Akhenaten, and it wears this type of crown. It's most likely Akhenaten. But I mean, when Akhenaten took power, I guess I should say shortly after he took power, he did the same kind of stuff with erasure of different, gods' names and depictions throughout Egypt.
We have another kind of question from Dory the Fish, asking if the gender of the torso maybe has any impact on whether it's standing or seated.
The gender of it. That is a good question. As we've seen from two-dimensional depictions in tombs, but also something that I didn't mention. If I might go back one last time to my slide, something that I didn't mention. Let me see. This statue, in fact, a pair statue of Akhenaten himself, which clearly depicts Akhenaten, was found right next to a statue that is in the exact same stone, exact same style, exact same size of his wife. So the one thing that Akhenaten brought is more or less equal access between him and particularly Nefertiti, his wife, as being the two principal people that had access to the worship. So to answer your question, in terms of the standing pose, we actually have archaeological physical evidence of also a Nefertiti being depicted as that. In terms of kind of a seated recipient of offerings on a royal throne, we have hints that Akhenaten was depicted as such, as I showed you from the archaeological fragments, but also from the depictions. And I believe there are also depictions of Nefertiti on a seated throne, but we don't have, to my knowledge, any statuary or any fragments that could hint that there might have been a statue of her depicted on a throne. Not to say, because one of the other things is as the small statuette showed, and all of these statuettes were found in people's houses throughout the city. So every person would have had a little shrine before you enter. I guess every rich person, but probably most people as well in Amarna would have had a little shrine of a little statuette of Akhenaten and Nefertiti performing some kind of ritual offering, in their house as a show of piety.
And I guess from what you've been saying in this particular period, in the reign of Akhenaten in particular, there would have been very few depictions of anyone other than them.
Exactly. And if it was anyone, people were still allowed to depict themselves. The royal family was the main, in terms of a statuary program from Amarna, that we have evidence from. Not to say that elite private individual did not have statues made of themselves. In fact, we have one of the only archaeologically established sculptors workshop in Amarna. Not to say that someone couldn't have gone to a sculptor and had it, but most of the depictions that have survived of individuals, we have individuals depict themselves in their tombs, so the tombs surrounding there. So the royal family, which includes the children, the parents and grandparents of Akhenaten, are very important to the establishment of his reign and the city itself. So those we do have statuary depictions of.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we've kept you going beyond the allotted hour, so if there's no other questions immediately jumping up, I suggest we. But this is the point where if we were in a seminar in the same room, we'd break out into applause, and I'd also ask you whether you wanted a glass of wine. But we'll have to leave that happy question for another time when we meet in person. But thank you very much again for the seminar. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure in talking to you.
And please join us in 2 weeks' time for the next seminar, where Scott Madry is going to talk about the historical ecology of southern Burgundy. Same place. Awesome. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.